We are in Daf Lamed Amud Beis, 30b, and the question is whether somebody can use an item that they cannot eat right now, they're not allowed to eat, whether that counts as an Eruv Techumin, whether that can be the meal that they set outside of a city to extend the boundaries of where they're allowed to go for a Dvar Mitzvah, for a mitzvah matter. And Sumchus seemingly made a distinction between a Nazir using wine, as we said, because he can retroactively have that annulled, whereas a Kohen, a non-Kohen, setting Teruma, because they could, even though he can annul the Teruma, meaning put it back into the original state of Tevel, of untithed, un-Teruma produce, but nevertheless, that's also not edible for him because he has to take Teruma from it. And you can't do that on Shabbos because, as we saw, the last statement, that since there's a rabbinic prohibition, there's a Durabanan, what we call a Shavus, to remove Teruma on Shabbos, because by doing so, you're fixing the produce to make it edible. And at the onset of Shabbos, when the Eruv is supposed to take effect, at that point, you cannot actually make it edible, and therefore it's going to be an invalid Eruv. So this is about just past midway on the daf. Whose opinion is this? That we learned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that there are various measures that pertain not to not as a general objective measure, but subjective in each case. Yesh Amru, there are some things for which the Chachamim said, each person according to his size. Whereas the Kohen has to take from a mincha a fistful and separation. Now everybody's palm is going to be different and fit different amount for a mincha. And the Kohen Gadol takes a full palms full of keturis, of incense. What counts as kares for drinking on Yom Kippur is going to be malo lugmav, a full cheekful. And what counts as 2 meals worth for an Eruv. So we see that an Eruv also is going to be subjective and not objective amount. Come on, Rabbi Zera. Amar Rabbi Zera Sumchus. This is the opinion of Sumchus. The Amar, it says that we need something that he can have for 2 meals that's worthy for him. And let's say that's distinct from and argues with Rav Shimon ben Elazar, who had said, and who said that we, for a sick person, an elderly person, the Eruv has to be as much as they would eat. But for a gluttonous person, somebody eats a lot, an average meal is sufficient. So this idea that we go for with everybody by what their needs are, so then a glutton would have to have a much larger meal. So he said, right, it's only as a leniency that we go with people. There's an average meal, and that's going to be sufficient for an Eruv. However, if this person is significantly is unable to eat that much and eat significantly less, so then that would be a valid Eruv for them because they are sickly or elderly. But for somebody who eats a glutton, somebody eats more than typical, so then the typical would be a valid Eruv. He'll be the objective measure would be sufficient. The Mishnah said further that
I think I kind of asked this question yesterday, but just to clarify again, you specifically said that this is all regarding an Eruv Tchumim, where it's my particular Eruv that I'm setting out 2,000 amos away from town. But none of this would have necessarily applied for an Eruv Chatzeros or Voz, because there, I'm smaller than my neighbor. He's bigger than me. He eats more than me. it's a whole different ball game, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll see when we get to the Erev Chatzeris what it requires: a full bread, a broken bread, and how much, and how much it needs per person. We'll see. That's going to be a different measure. Here we're talking about a meal in order to become a shvisa, 2 meals worth of any substance outside in the field somewhere. Well, the kohen beis hapras, and you can even put this. The Mishnah had said a kohen could put it in a beis hapras. A beis hapras, we said it. The Mishnah to review is a field that had a grave that was then plowed, and the grave was destroyed, and with it we now have human remains or bones throughout the field, potentially, and a kohen walking through could touch it and become tummy. Now, the bone itself is not going to be enough to have tumas ohel, where his hovering over it will make him tummy, because that would be much more problematic. But for that, you need most of the spine or most of the bones. It's not going to. In this case, that's not what we're talking about. We're not concerned with that. What we're concerned of is he may actually touch it. So how can the kohen have an eruv in there? He may become tummy and is not allowed to. That a person is allowed to just fan, blow at a beis pras, and it'll be fine, because whatever shards are there of this bone are going to be small enough, and then he can just blow it away, and it's not going to make him tummy. And anything larger that would not get blown away, he would notice and not touch, step over it. Rabbi Yehuda ben Barami Yeshped Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beis Haprasha Nidashtar. And furthermore, if it's been heavily walked on, it's been pressed, meaning that people walk on it a lot, so then it's going to be tar as well, because the bones would be stepped into the ground and be lost or crushed, and so it's not a concern for the kohen. Rabbi Yehuda Alf Beis Hakvaros. Rabbi Yehuda says actually it's not only in a beis hapras where there was a lost and plowed grave, but also any beis hakvaros, any graveyard you can put the eruv into, even if he's a kohen, but he can't get there. So so we learned because he can make a chatzitza, he can make a barrier that is allowed to carry him through, because he can go in a box, in a tower, etc. Now, Kasavar oil zorak shmei oil. He follows the opinion that a movable barrier, a movable chest that's large enough that it itself is not considered a vessel. We learned this multiple times now, that a vessel is only susceptible to tumah as a vessel if it is if it can be carried even when full. And the concept is that a maximum size is 40 seah. If the box, the chest, the cabinet, whatever it may be, can contain more than 40 seah liquid, which is 1 amma by 1 amma by 3 amma. It's no longer considered a vessel. It's considered too large to be susceptible to tumah. So this is too large to be susceptible to tumah, and so he can be carried into it or use this to go into this space. Now, this would be relevant for a car, this would be relevant for a plane, and so on. But Tosfos over here says that it's only when it's stationary, when it's not moving. But if it's moving, it no longer constitutes as a barrier. Other Rishonim say, no, of course, even if it's moving, it does constitute as a barrier. And for Tosfos, we're going to have a problem. How does this person use it to get into the graveyard? Seemingly, what he's doing is he's in a sedan, in some sort of box that's being brought in to the graveyard to get his eruv, and yet we apply this concept that a movable box, a movable barrier, constitutes a barrier. In any case, so that's what we learned, that a movable barrier constitutes a barrier. And this is based on this machlokas, the Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Somebody who enters lands outside of Eretz Yisrael, which which cause a tuma to a person, a rabbinic tuma d'Rabbanan. But this person went inside a self-contained structure, such as a box, a car, whatever it may be. So Rebbe says he still receives, John, that's the point. The airplane, according to Ravid and others, would be a barrier because of Oil Zorak, because of a movable container. And the concept is that it serves as a barrier. The Tues says, however, it only serves as a barrier when stationary. It doesn't seem to fit our Gemara, but that's what Tues over here says. So Rebbe says he is susceptible to Tumah on account of that a movable barrier does not constitute a barrier. Rabbi Yehuda says it is a barrier, and therefore he's tar mamaykam and palgi. And what's the basis of machlokas? As we just said, mar savar oil zaruk lav shmei olam al savar mar savar oil zaruk shmei oil. The machlokas is whether a movable barrier counts as a barrier or not. V'hada Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda says not a movable barrier, a movable tent, really, but that's the barrier here is the tent. V'hada Tanya, this we learn. Rabbi Yehuda says ma'arvin l'koyin Torah b'truma Torah b'kever. So now we're on 31a at the top. That Rabbi Yehuda said that you can use an eruv of teruma Torah of teruma for a kohen, and you can put it at a grave site. Now the Gemara is going to ask, well, the teruma became tamei by putting it there, and if the teruma becomes tamei, it's not edible even to a kohen. And how is this kohen going to get in to get it? And how is he going to pick it up? So the Gemara is going to deal with all those things. So ma'arvin l'kohen Torah. You can make an eruv for a kohen who is pure at this time, with teruma tahara, with teruma that's pure at this time, but kever at a single grave. Now, how is he going to go in there? He's going to go inside another container. But the food itself, as soon as it put down, it became tummy. Well, and we know food is only susceptible to tumah if liquids got to it, and this food, the teruma never had a liquid on it, or maybe it was kneaded with fruit juice. It was kneaded with fruit juice, and the types of fruit juice that don't make produce susceptible to tumah. So how is he going to pick it up? Once he picks it up, anything he's going to do, he's going to become tamei in just taking it. Zagmara says, he's picking it up in a vessel that's not susceptible to tumah. It's a flat piece of wood. Zagmara said, which is not susceptible to tumah. But if you take a flat piece of wood, now you've created an ohel. Now you've created a tent, as it were, a hovering space over the grave. So what he's doing is he's actually holding it on its side, so there's no tent. It's too narrow to count as a tent. It doesn't have the requisite amount of space hovering over, because it's less than a tefach. So it's on. Let's say he takes a cutting board. It's a flat piece of wood, but he's holding it on the side, and he picks up the food with the side of it, so there's no ohel. Well, then, great. So he's taking care of all of it, and he can access the food. So why would the Rabbanan say that it doesn't work as an eruv? Kasavri asaliknes bayis bisurano. There's a different reason. This is a grave. You're not allowed to be kuna shvisi. You're not allowed to acquire your space in Shabbos in a place that you're not allowed to benefit from. The grave belongs to the person buried there, and you're benefiting yourself from that space. The Chaldar Rav mutter. Well, Rav Yehuda is going to hold that it's permissible to create yourself a space there? Yes, because Kasava mitzvahs lav lehenesnu. Since the eruv is a mitzvah, because he's only traveling outside the city for a mitzvah purpose, and therefore he's allowed to do it because mitzvahs are not a personal benefit. So similarly, you'd be allowed to make a sukkah there, because the sukkah, even though you're eating there and you're benefiting, but the mitzvah, it's for a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is not considered your personal benefit. Well, then it seems like this is a machlokas now. That Rabbi Yehuda says you can make the eruv there on account of that it's not a personal benefit, and the chachamim who prohibit obviously are going to hold that it is a personal benefit, and that's going to be a machlokas. So when Rava said the general rule, the concept of a mitzvah is not considered your own personal benefit, and anything that's prohibited in benefit can still be done as a mitzvah. Is that a general rule or a machlokas? That maybe he taught this teaching, which is actually a disagreement in the Tanai in the Mishnah. Rava said no. If we hold that you can only use an eruv for a mitzvah, as we've been saying, that you can only set an eruv outside the city to travel beyond when you're going for a mitzvah, to visit the sick, to study Torah, to daven, you're going for a mitzvah. But if you're not going for a mitzvah, you couldn't do it. So then everybody would agree, mitzvah slav lehonisnitnu. The mitzvah is not a personal benefit. So the machlokas is this. Rabbi Yehuda says you may not make it unless it's a mitzvah. You may not make an eruv unless it's a mitzvah. And therefore, since it's not a personal benefit, you can make an eruv at a gravesite. And the chachamim say, no, you're allowed to make an eruv just to take a walk because you want to hike somewhere. So you can do that on Shabbos too. And that's why you can't make the eruv at a grave, because it's a personal need and it's a personal benefit. Well, then we have another problem, because Rav Yosef said a general rule, you're not allowed to make an eruv unless it's for a mitzvah. And you're telling me now that it's not a general rule, it's actually machlokas. So what we're going to say is, so Rav Yosef says no. Everybody agrees that you can't make an eruv only unless it's for a mitzvah purpose. And the Kuli Alma and mitzvah, and everybody agrees that a mitzvah is not a personal benefit. And so, if you're only making an eruv for a var mitzvah, for a mitzvah purpose, and mitzvahs are not personal benefits, so it's not considered that you're benefiting by putting an eruv at the gravesite. So why would the chachamim prohibit? It makes sense. Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to do it because, after all, you're doing a mitzvah, and it's not a personal benefit because mitzvahs are not personal benefits. But why the chachamim disagree? And the machlokes is based on this. Marsava keeping the Kollel eruv le'nichali demintura. The first opinion of Yehuda says you're only putting the eruv there for the defining that as your space so that you can travel beyond, but you don't actually need the food. And so once Shabbos comes in, as the day goes on, you don't care whether you have access to that food or not. You're not actually relying on that as your meal, and therefore there's no personal benefit as well secondary to it. However, the Chachamim say no. You want to keep that food there because you want, in your travels, you want to be able to take a bite. And therefore, besides for the Kana Shvisa, besides for using the space to define your Shabbos space, you also want it to be kept so that you can have your food when you need it. And that is a personal benefit. That's not an essential part of the Eruv. That's a personal benefit. And that's the reason you can't use a grave, a personal grave, an individual's grave. Mishnah. The next Mishnah is going to talk about various levels of teruma or tithes that are not allowed to be used or allowed to be used. As a review, so that we can understand all of the cases, we'll go through some of the processes of what happens when somebody harvests their grains. Let's say, well, let's use wheat. The wheat harvest comes, they harvest all their grain, and they make it into bundles. At that point, they are obligated already in the tithe, in maaser, but they are not yet obligated in teruma, which is only obligated once they make a kri, once they separate the kernels from the chaff. and they make a pile of that. Then they're obligated in teruma. But you're supposed to do it in this process, in this order. First, take approximately 2% teruma, the elevation, which goes to the Kohen. Then you take 10% of the 98% that's still there, so 9.8, and you give that to the Levi. That's Maaser Rishon, the first tithe. The Levi then takes 10% of that, 0.98, and he gives that back he gives that to a Kohen. So the Kohen now got 2% of the entire thing from the owner, and another 0.98 from the Levi as a tithe out of his tithe. That's called terumas maaser, the elevation of the tithe. And then in the first and second, fourth and fifth year, there's another tithe that is taken, but that goes to the owner himself, but he has to bring it to Yerushalayim to eat. And since he's not going to go every day, he then transfers it onto a coin, the second tithe onto a coin, and he brings that to Yerushalayim to eat in Yerushalayim. So of the remaining, he's already given 2%, and then 9.8%, 2% as approximately for Truma, 9.8% exactly, a tithe of the remainder to the Levi. Then he gives an additional 10% of the 89 roughly percent that's there. That's 8.9, and he takes that to Yerushalayim. That's the Ma'aser Sheni. On the third and sixth year, that becomes Ma'aser Ani. That's a tithe that goes, the second tithe goes to the poor. Okay, so what we're going to be dealing with is somebody who either did it out of order, as the Gemara is going to say, he took the tithe before it became obligated in teruma, which is when it was still in shibboleth and was still in stalks. And he had made bundles of his grain, but he had not yet separated it out and made the kernels into a pile. But the proper order is teruma, first, 2%, ma'aser rishon, the tithe that goes to the Levi, and then terumas maser, the tithe from that the Levi gives to the Kohen. Now, when somebody goes to the market and they purchase produce, it was common, everybody did the teruma, everybody would take 2% and give it to the Kohen. However, the tithe that went to the Levi, the 10% of the remainder, which is about 9.8%, that most people did, but not everybody. And so you go to the market and you purchase produce, there's a concern that maybe the maser had never been taken. So there was a concept of demai. Demai is produce that you purchase in the market and you don't know whether the maser had been taken, that you would then take out of abundance caution, a rabbinic enactment to take another tithe of after you've purchased it in case it had not been tithed yet, maser had not been taken. So you have purchased produce in the market. You have not yet taken the tithe. That's called demai. Ma'arvin b'demai. You can use demai produce, which you're not supposed to be eating until you take the tithe. You can use it as your eruv. And the Gemara is going to explain because you're allowed to eat it. There are ways that you're allowed to eat. You can also use the first teruma. First tithe, masa rishon, shenitl trumasa, that the teruma had been taken, meaning the Levi who received 10%, meaning 9.8% after the teruma had been taken, he now gives his 10% to the Kohen, and then he can use it. And the Gemara is going to say, obviously, I mean that's exactly what's supposed to happen. And the Gemara is going to change the scenario. And in the second tithe, or hektish, which was redeemed on a coin. Again, the Gemara is going to say, that seems pretty obvious. That's what's supposed to happen. Why? That's all produce is that way. Why wouldn't you be allowed to use it? And Kohanim can use teruma, but they can't use untithed, unteruma produce. And you cannot use the first tithe that didn't have its 10%, then which the Levi is supposed to take off and give to the Kohen. That part also cannot be used because again, it wasn't done properly. And again, the Gemara is going to say, obviously, you're not allowed to eat it. Or the second tithe and hektish, which have not been redeemed. Again, seemingly obvious because you're not allowed to eat it outside of Yerushalayim. So first the Gemara says, Demai, that he's not allowed to eat it. So why would it be a good eruv? That should be the same as the Mishnah before, which in one opinion says you're not allowed to have teruma for a non-kohen. So when it says because a person could renounce all of his possessions and then become poor, and poor people are allowed to eat the mai without taking a tithe. Chachamim, when they enacted this tithe, when you purchase produce from the market, was only for people that are not poor. Poor people don't have to also, even if somebody is wealthy but doesn't have access to that funds, they're traveling, also are allowed to do so, as we see. Ani, because the person, if he renounces the ownership of his assets, will then be a poor person. And then he would eat it, and so therefore so therefore he can make an error with this because in potential he has the access to it right now. The Tananas we learn machilas hani in the mai. We can give poor people demai to eat. They don't have to take another tithe from there. And now we go to Laman Aleph on the base. Vesachsanai, and also someone traveling. Rashi says the typical was soldiers that were put into the villages and the villagers have to feed them. So you can even give them demai. Amar Rav Huna. So Rav Huna said, Tana, we have a brisa that says, Bishami it's machlokes between Bishami and Beisila. Bishami says you cannot give the poor demai. They too have to have it separated first. And Beisila say no, you can give the poor demai. The first tithe that the teruma that the Levi had done his part and taken the 10% off and given it to the Kohen, that may be eaten, may be used as an error. So obviously, that's exactly what produce is. That you took the maaseh, you took the tithe, and then you gave from that to the Kohen. So pshita. So this person actually did it out of order. Remember, we said that the obligation of teruma comes once you've separated the grain and made a pile of grains. But if it's still in shibalim form, it's still in the stalk. You've just used a sickle, you cut down some stalks, you made a bundle, and now you have these bundles, and you're not yet obligated in teruma. You are already obligated in maser and tithe, but you really are supposed to wait until you take the teruma first. But you didn't, and you had 10 bundles. You took one, you gave it to the Levi, and you said, "Here's your 10%." So now the Levi has a tithe that never had the teruma taken out of it, but it never was obligated in teruma either. But it didn't have the teruma taken out of it, and now when he gives his 10% to the Kohen, perhaps that's not enough because the original gift of the Kohen was missing. That he had separated the maser prior when it was still in a stock form before it had been separated. And he gave the tithe that he's supposed to. However, what the great teruma, meaning the original first teruma that's supposed to go to the Kohen, was never taken. The owner, the farmer never did it, and the Levi never did it. And like Rabbi Bo says that's okay. The Amar Ishlakish, and Amar Ishlakish, Amar Bo, Amar Ishlakish, Maser Rishon, the first tithe, Sheikh Dime B'Shibalim, that he went ahead and it was quick to give it prior to it being separated. It was still in stock. Pater mit Truma Gedola. At that point, it is exempt of Truma Gedola and no longer is going to need it. Shenemar, as it says, as it says that the Levi is going to separate out from there a teruma for Hashem, an elevation for Hashem, a tithe out of the tithe. Maser mena maser, one tithe out of the tithe. Amarti l'chavalei teruma gedola terumas maser mena maser, but not a double teruma. First the great teruma, about 2%, and then on top of that another 10%, the terumas maser, all out of the part that the Levi got, the tithe that the Levi got. Well then, Rav Papa said to Abaye, if you're telling me that there is the Levi never has to give the original teruma, the teruma gedola, the great teruma, which is the 2% originally obligated prior to the 10%, that he doesn't have to do that. Well, then even if he separated the tithe and gave the Levi his 10% prior, after you already separated the grains and made a pile of grains, which we call a kri, still he should be exempt because the Torah tells us he doesn't have to give the Levi who got his 10% doesn't have to give more than the 10%. He doesn't have to give the original teruma. Amalei Alecha Makrai says, no, actually for you there's a verse that says explicitly he does have to. Mikol Masre Sechem Torimas Kol Terumas Hashem. From all of your tithes, you have to give all of the elevations of Hashem. Oh, meaning that from the tithe itself there could be more than one teruma. It could be two terumas. So the Gemara said, wait. So you just told me one verse says that you don't have to give teruma from maser. You only give a tithe from the maser. And then there's another verse that says you have to give all the terumas from the maser. Omairos. So how do you see that one is applying to when it was separated in the stock form, and one is when it's already been separated and made a pile, and then you gave the tithe? So Gemara says, Hai idgin, Hai le idgin, because one is already became grains. One already became dagon, is the term. So once you've separated it and made a pile, now there's already an obligation of teruma on the owner, on the farmer. And so if he made a mistake and he separated the teruma, the maser out, the tithe, and he gave it to the Levi, now the Levi has produce that already became obligated in the 2% teruma. Oh, so then he has to do that, and then on top of that, give the 2%, the 10% that is his obligation. He has to take care of the owner's obligation and his own obligation because that obligation was already set on the produce. Whereas if the grains were still in a stock, then the owner never had the obligation yet, and therefore the Levi is exempt.
Don't we say that he could, even if he just gave one kernel of grain? What is that referring to?
Teruma. Teruma, when I said 2%, I said approximately 2%. That's the general term. The general minhag was to give 2%. People that were stingy would give 1/60th. People that were a little bit more giving would give a 40th. So that's approximately what it is. But actually, one grain, one kernel itself, would be enough that somebody had an entire silo full of produce. He could say, this one kernel is my teruma, and while that's an ayin ra, it's considered being stingy and being, not being gracious with the mitzvah, but it would allow him to eat the rest of the produce.
But theoretically, the Levi could just give him a kernel, and he'd be perfectly good.
It would make, well, he wouldn't be perfectly good. That would be an ayin ra, but it would allow him to eat the produce. Correct.
He could give him fried chicken.
Sorry?
He could give him fried chicken from the kernel.
Not as your teruma, but yes. And then the second tithe, or hektish that had been redeemed. Pshita. Again, the Gemara says, that's obvious. That's every produce. That's what it is. You give your second tithe, and you've redeemed it, and so that you're allowed to eat. The halacha is that when you take the second tithe, and then you transfer it onto a coin, you have to give an additional 25% value, which is halachic fifth, which is always a fifth. The total is the fifth. So if you add 100% and you add 25, so now 125%, 25 is going to be a fifth of that total. So, and you have to add 25%, and he didn't. So let's say his maaser is worth $100. He should really transfer it onto $125 of coins, and instead he transferred it onto 100, and he still owes the 25. Nevertheless, the transfer is valid, and now he can eat the produce. It does not hold back the transfer from working. But you cannot use tevel untithed produce. The Gemara says, obviously, you can't use untithed produce. You're not allowed to eat it. Pshita. So that's obvious. So what we're talking about is that it's a rabbinic tevel. On a Torah level, it's not obligated in teruma maser. Why? As we'll see, for instance, Kagon, Shazara Batsa Chainanakov. He planted it in a pot. It's produce that didn't grow in the ground. It grew in a pot that doesn't have any holes. It's a solid pot. And therefore, on a total level. It's not attached to the ground. You don't have to tithe. Chachamim said, no, nevertheless, it looks like produce. You have to tithe it. And so that rabbinic tithe also is going to make it, if you didn't do the Truma Maser that are rabbinically obligated, you're not allowed to eat this produce, and therefore you can't use it as an eruv. And also in the first tithe that goes to the Levi, and now the Levi has it, he may not make an eruv with it if he didn't take his 10%, the terumas maser, that he has to give to the kohen. So Gemara says, obviously, he's not allowed to eat it. Pshita. So what it means is that he actually did take his 10% that he's supposed to give to the kohen. However, he didn't give the 2% that the owner neglected to give. For instance, the case we were talking about before. The produce that was harvested, then it was separated, and you have a pile of grain. Now, this pile of grain is obligated in the primary truma, the truma gadola. The owner, however, the farmer, neglected to do so and skipped over it and gave the Levi his 10% before he had given the Kohen his 2%. Now, as we saw before, the Levi, not only does he have to give the 10% that you always have to give, called terumas maser, the tithe of the tithe that he gives to the Kohen, he also has to give the additional, the 2% that the owner neglected, or as Michael said, it doesn't have to be 2%. He can even give one grain, even though that's not the appropriate way of doing it. It would allow him to eat it, but he didn't do even that, and so he's not allowed to eat it at this point, and that's what the Mishnah is talking about. I may think of the Rav Papa like Rav Papa said to Abaye that it should be exempt because you only have to give one tithe from that tithe. The Levi only has to give the primary truma. The secondary trumas maaser. Kamashmal and Kadeshamim saying no, since it was already an obligation to the owner because he had already made a pile of grain. Now the Levi, because the owner had neglected to do it, he must give that 2%. Otherwise, he can't eat it. That's the primary truma. Also, is necessary to begin. Also, the second tithe to Meiser Sheni or Hektish that had not been redeemed. So obviously, if it's not been redeemed, he can't eat it. He has to take it to Yerushalayim. He has to redeem it before he can eat it. Pshita. He did redeem it. However, he didn't do it properly. He didn't do it on a proper coin. Meiser, what would be that? A tithe. Simon, that he redeemed it, but he did so until with a coin which is called an asimon. Rashi says here that is it's a proper coin. It's the size of a coin. It's the shape of a coin. However, it hadn't had the imprint yet. So the minting of coins would be first that it would have the amount of silver or copper or whatever that coin was in its shape, and then they would then engrave it because you had to know who was emperor or king or whatever at that time, and they would imprint that separately. So he had a coin that had no face to it, and that is called an asimon, and it's not a valid coin for the redemption of masim. The Torah says, which in the simple translation would mean, and you will gather your coins in your hand. But the drash is, the Torah doesn't have to tell you, you will gather your coins. It just says, and bring the coins to Yerushalayim and buy the produce. Why say, but tzarta? Tzarta is to tell you that it has an image, tzura, the sheyeshel of tzura. And similarly for hektish achila agav karka. Hektish, which you transferred it, but you transferred it instead of onto a coin or onto movable property, you transferred it onto real property. And that's not valid. The Rachmanam of a nasana kesef v'kamlu. The Torah says you will give the money and the silver, and then you will acquire it, and you didn't. And so this is an invalid transfer, and therefore that's what we're talking about. That you cannot eat this produce, even though you tried to redeem it, but you redeemed it in an invalid way, so you can't use it as an eruv. You want to establish your kuna shvisa, you're acquiring your Shabbos, your resting space, somewhere outside of the city so you can travel beyond for a mitzvah. So somebody who says, okay, I don't have time, I'm busy. Here, go out to this and this place. and put this meal down for me, and that will be my acquiring that space for Shabbos. That's and so Sholech Eruv is somebody who sends his Eruv biyad in the hands of someone who doesn't have a valid, not a valid, a reliable mind of its own, whether it's a deaf mute, someone who's cognitively impaired, or a child, or or somebody who doesn't believe in Eruv, as the Gemara tells the Kutites, the Sumerians, don't believe in the concept of Eruv, so he doesn't believe in Eruv, so you can't rely on him. Eino Eruv, so that Eruv does not count. It has to be that it was placed there by someone who can have proper intent. But if he told somebody else to accept it from them for him, that would count as an Eruv. So Gemara says, a child cannot make an Eruv. But we learn in the statement of Huna that a child can gather the Eruv, can accept the Eruv. And that's a case of Eruv Chatzeros, the courtyard Eruv. The courtyard Eruv, we saw, everybody has to put in bread for a joint meal. So a child can go and accept the Eruv, collect the Eruv, essentially acquiring it from each one of the partners in the courtyard by walking around with his basket, knocks on the door and says, Eruv, please. And, somebody puts in a roll, a baguette, or whatever it may be, right? So each person, he can go and collect it. So you see, even a child who doesn't have the intent to acquire it on behalf of everyone, nevertheless, it counts as a good acquisition of the Eruv for the community, for the courtyard. There's a distinction by the Eruv of a courtyard where they're sharing the space, and that space really is shared in any case. So that really is an Eruv of its own. It happens automatically. And so the child really isn't doing anything. He's just collecting the food because they're all already partners in that space in any case. Whereas when you're acquiring your space for Shabbos, you're redefining your space. My space is here, and somebody has to put a meal down somewhere else with the intent of that transferring my home space to out there, and that requires intent. And for a Ruve Techumen, a child cannot do it. Or you cannot use somebody who doesn't believe in the concept of Eruv. Saman, who is that? This is the Kutib. We've seen the Gemara elsewhere has a machlokas whether they were proper converts or converts only out of a fear of a dangerous situation. In any case, even if they were proper converts, there were certain mitzvahs that they kept and kept well. And there's an opinion in the Gemara that says that you're allowed to rely on them on those mitzvahs because those mitzvahs they really were very careful about. However, certain things they did not believe in, and then they didn't do those. So you can't rely on them because yes, you ask them to take the Eruv out there, but their intent is not going to be there. Even if they actually put it there, their intent's not going to be there because they didn't believe in the concept. And so therefore you cannot rely on them. Tomorrow we'll continue with the concept of somebody else acquiring or setting it up with the shaliach.